The sharp cry of a metal detector splits the silence of Glacier National Park. Deep in Montana's backcountry, 43 miles from the nearest road, treasure hunter Mike Sullivan expects nothing more than old coins or scraps from forgotten mining camps. Instead, he uncovers a rusted school locker buried beneath decades of needles and soil. Inside, sealed plastic bags guard the lost belongings of 3 teenagers who vanished in 1979. A wallet with Bradley Morrison's license, a class ring etched with Kevin Walsh's initials, a notebook in Jennifer Frazer's careful handwriting describing black trucks, hidden watches, and the fear of being followed. These names are not just familiar, they are infamous. Bradley, Kevin, and Jennifer were the trio who disappeared one autumn night in Whitefish Falls, leaving behind a staged car at Miller's Creek and a town divided by suspicion for nearly half a century. The discovery means only one thing. The story everyone believed for 45 years was wrong. What forced 3 teenagers to bury proof of danger? 40 miles from where they were last seen, who in their quiet hometown had secrets worth killing? For if you want to uncover the truth, like this video and subscribe to Unscripted Tales. Tell me in the comments which city you are watching this cold case story from. And let us reach 5,000 likes so we can continue to bring hidden stories like this to light. The forest around Mike shifts from wilderness to witness as he pulls. The locker-free hinges groan when the crowbar snaps them open. The air thick with rust and damp earth. Items no one should find in such a place lie waiting like a message from 1979. His hands shake as he photographs every detail before calling the Park Service, knowing instinctively that this is not lost property. This is evidence. By evening, crime scene tape circles the site, and photographs travel fast across Flathead County. Detective Sarah Chen studies the images in her office, her stomach sinking as the names stare back at her. Bradley Morrison, Kevin Walsh, Jennifer Frazer. She knows them well, though she never met them. Every officer in this corner of Montana knows them, because the Morrison case was the curse passed from one generation of law enforcement to the next. Now, for the first time in 45 years, their belongings have surfaced in a place no one ever searched, far from where the story began. Chen understands the implications immediately. Someone buried these items within weeks of the disappearance. Someone chose a location where loggers would not cut and where no development would reach. Someone wanted this evidence to survive long after the teenagers themselves had vanished. As Chen sets out for Glacier National Park, she cannot escape the weight of one question that cuts sharper than any discovery. If their belongings were hidden here, then where are Bradley, Kevin, and Jennifer? Whitefish Falls in the late 1970s looked like the kind of town where nothing ever truly changed. A dot on Montana's Highway 2 with fewer than 900 residents. Its life revolved around the sawmill, the small railroad depot, and the Lutheran church that drew nearly every family on Sunday mornings. People knew each other's names, their family histories, and even the stories of their grandparents. A stranger passing through might think the town was too quiet to ever hold a mystery, but the truth is that quiet towns can keep the loudest secrets. It was in this world that 3 inseparable teenagers grew up. Bradley Morrison, the dependable son of the local hardware store owner, was strong, athletic, and steady in every decision he made. Teachers often said he was not the brightest in the class, but he was the one who always finished his work on time and could be counted on. Kevin Walsh, on the other hand, was smaller, restless, and full of ambition. He dreamed of leaving Whitefish Falls behind, studying journalism at the State University, and one day writing stories big enough to reach beyond Montana's borders. Then there was Jennifer Frazer, the thoughtful balance between them. Sharp enough to win a scholarship anywhere she wanted, yet tied by loyalty to the town her grandfather had helped build after arriving from Scotland. The 3 of them shared childhood adventures, first jobs, first heartbreaks, and the belief that whatever came after high school, they would face it together. On October 14, 1979, their lives changed forever. The Sunday began like so many others. Families filled pews at the Lutheran church in the morning. By dinner time, each teen sat at home, eating with their parents, and making plans for the evening. Their plan was simple: meet at the town library and finish a history project on logging families, a topic tied to the very roots of Whitefish Falls. Jennifer's mother even prepared extra sandwiches, certain the three would lose track of time, the way they always did when studying together. But the meeting never happened. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, waited for them until nearly 9 at night, before locking the doors and walking home. She assumed they had forgotten. By the next morning, it was clear something far more troubling had taken place. Bradley's bed had not been slept in. Kevin's mother noticed his bedroom window left open, though untouched. Jennifer's purse and books were gone from her room, and so was her car. That same morning, Deputy Martinez made the discovery that turned worry into fear. Jennifer's blue Plymouth Duster sat abandoned at an odd angle beside Miller's Creek Bridge, 20 minutes from town. The location made no sense. The trio had no reason to be on that road. The front wheels of the car rested only 2 feet from the guardrail, as if the vehicle had been pulled over quickly and then left behind. When the deputy opened the door, he found Jennifer's purse sitting neatly on the passenger seat. Inside were her student identification card, lip gloss, and $12 in cash, untouched. On the dashboard, placed almost like a display, rested Kevin Walsh's class ring, the one he had worn proudly since the spring, and in the glove compartment, tucked carefully inside, was Bradley Morrison's wallet with his license, some folded bills, and a school dance photo of the 3 friends together. Sheriff Douglas arrived as Martinez photographed the scene. He knew immediately that something felt wrong. Teenagers in trouble do not place their belongings in neat order. They scatter things. They leave behind signs of panic or haste. Here, every item looked staged, as if someone wanted the car to tell a specific story. The setting sun cast its light across the creek, and the ring glimmered as though calling attention. To itself, Douglas understood the difference between chaos and control. What he saw at Miller's Creek was control. The water beneath the bridge was shallow, hardly 3 feet deep. Drowning 3 healthy teenagers in it was nearly impossible. There were no footprints, no broken brush, no marks to suggest a struggle or an escape. Only the eerie silence of a car, abandoned with its contents deliberately arranged. For Douglas, it was the beginning of a case that would weigh on Whitefish Falls for decades. For the families, it was the first night their children did not come home, and as darkness settled across the valley, the most chilling truth lingered in the air. The 3 friends had vanished without a trace. And all that remained was a car staged like a message. What kind of secret would force someone to carefully arrange that car and erase every sign of what really happened? The night air around Miller's Creek was cold enough to sting the lungs. Yet Sheriff Douglas and Deputy Martinez stayed until their flashlights began to dim. They walked every foot of the gravel shoulder, crouched by the banks, and leaned over the guardrail again and again, as though the water might suddenly reveal a secret. The creek flowed calmly, shallow and unthreatening, its smooth stones visible through 3 feet of moving water. If 3 teenagers had struggled here, there would have been broken brush, torn footprints in the mud, or at least one personal item dropped in panic. But there was nothing. The car looked like it had been placed, not abandoned. The absence of chaos was louder than any evidence. By the next morning, word of the disappearance spread through Whitefish Falls like fire on dry grass. It was not just a small-town rumor, it was a wave of fear. 3 young people who were the heart of the senior class had vanished without a trace, and their car sat only 20 minutes outside of town like an unsolved riddle. Neighbors who had known each other their entire lives met in the school gymnasium that now served as a command post. Topographical maps were unrolled on borrowed tables from the Lutheran church. Red markers divided the wilderness into grids. Radios were passed out to men and women who had never used them before. Instructions were given carefully by Sheriff Douglas, because he knew that well-meaning volunteers could destroy evidence without realizing it. Logging crews set aside their chainsaws and brought heavy trucks to help transport searchers into the woods. Farmers left their cattle and grain fields to walk miles of ridges and timberland. Even retired teachers and store clerks joined the effort, refusing to stay home while 3 young lives were unaccounted for. Each night, they returned, exhausted, their clothes smelling of pine and damp earth, only to report back that they had found nothing. Not a single trace of Bradley, Kevin, or Jennifer. For days after the teenagers disappeared, the state police arrived. Their presence shifted the tone. With them came search dogs trained for tracking, forensic specialists, and officers unburdened by small-town familiarity. Where Douglas had asked questions gently, the state investigators pressed harder. They spoke to families with sharp precision and compared notes from neighbors. It was then that details surfaced that had never been mentioned before. Jennifer's younger sister confessed that Jennifer had been on edge in recent weeks. She locked her bedroom window every night, checked it twice, sometimes 3 times, and once asked if their parents kept important documents hidden in a safe deposit box. Kevin's mother recalled phone calls that her son had been receiving. The caller never gave a name. Kevin's answers were short, nervous, and the conversations always ended abruptly when she entered the room. Bradley's father admitted that his son had asked about the hardware store records, asking how far back they went and who had keys to the building besides his own family. To investigators, these details painted a disturbing picture. The 3 teenagers had not been carefree in the days before their disappearance. They had been watchful, they had been nervous. They had been quietly preparing for something. Inside the abandoned car at Miller's Creek. One more piece of evidence deepened the mystery. Among Jennifer's belongings was her history textbook, open to a chapter on the early logging families of Montana. In the margins, she had written careful notes about local surnames that still carried power in Whitefish Falls. To most people, these were ordinary school notes, but to investigators, they looked like the work of a girl chasing answers. What began as a desperate community search for lost teenagers was now shifting into something darker. There were no footprints, no sightings, no trace of 3 young lives except the car that looked staged. Instead, there were secrets whispered through late-night calls, questions about records, and notes about families that had shaped the town for generations. The case was no longer about 3 teenagers who might have run away or become lost in the wilderness. It was about 3 friends who seemed to know something they were never meant to discover. And the haunting question grew louder with each passing day. If they had uncovered a secret that powerful, who had decided they would never be allowed to speak of it? Weeks turned into months. And the search for Bradley Morrison, Kevin Walsh, and Jennifer Frazer brought no answers. The maps spread across folding tables had been marked and erased until the paper tore. The dogs had tracked nothing. The creek had been dragged more times than anyone could count. Hope was thinning, and the silence of the forest was beginning to echo inside the town itself. Whitefish Falls was no longer united in grief. It was divided by suspicion. That division first broke open in the church hall during a community meeting. Families filled the pews, desperate for guidance, when Harold Morrison, Bradley's own father, stood and spoke words that froze the room. He said maybe it was time to accept that the teenagers had chosen to leave. The suggestion landed like a hammer. Margaret Frazer's face turned pale, and Kevin's father clenched his fists in anger. The silence that followed was not agreement, it was disbelief. A man known for his steady voice was now saying his own son might have walked away willingly. The room erupted. Kevin Walsh's father accused Harold of protecting his business reputation more than his son. Margaret Frazer demanded to know what Harold was hiding that made him so eager to end the search. Neighbors who had shared meals and pews for years turned on one another. Their grief twisted into suspicion. That night, Whitefish Falls stopped being one community. Invisible lines were drawn that would not fade. The Walsh family, refusing to trust the official investigation, hired a private detective from Kalispell. He walked the same roads, asked sharper questions, and pressed people for details about October 14th. At first, a few locals spoke, but soon the doors began to close. Stories changed, timelines shifted. Witnesses contradicted their own earlier statements. The detective found gaps that made no sense, but he also found something more chilling than Silence, he found fear. People were not forgetting. They were deliberately keeping quiet. As weeks turned into years, the fracture spread through the town like a crack in glass. Neighbors avoided each other on Main Street. Church attendance dropped because families chose different services to avoid confrontation. The annual holiday parade, once the pride of Whitefish Falls, was cancelled for the first time in living memory. Businesses began to feel the strain as customers traveled to neighboring towns, rather than walk past faces they no longer trusted. By the early 1980s, Whitefish Falls had retreated into a heavy silence. The friendships that had defined the town for generations dissolved, replaced by whispered conversations and narrowed eyes. The three missing teenagers had not only vanished from the community, they had taken the heart of Whitefish Falls with them. The question that now lingered in every household was a quiet one no one dared to ask aloud. Who among them was carrying the truth about that October night? The weight of failure hung heavy on Sheriff Douglas. For years he carried the files, the photographs, and the unanswered questions that refused to let him sleep. He walked past the evidence boxes every morning in his small office, and each glance felt like a reminder that 3 young lives had slipped beyond his reach. By 1984, he could no longer bear it. Officially, he retired for health reasons, but privately, he told his wife that he could not spend another year staring at the unsolved case of Bradley, Kevin, and Jennifer. The files were moved into the courthouse basement, stacked among other forgotten mysteries. Dust gathered. The pages began to yellow. What once had been a desperate search became nothing more than cold paper. The families did not remain whole. The Morrisons sold their hardware store and left Whitefish Falls behind. Unable to stand the stares and whispered conversations that followed them down Main Street, Kevin's parents divorced, his mother moving to Seattle, his father staying, but growing more reclusive with every passing year. Only Margaret Frazer stayed, her grief binding her to the town that had taken her daughter. She became known as the keeper of the missing. She attended every town meeting, every church service, every community gathering. Her presence reminded people that the questions had never been answered, no matter how much the town tried to bury them. The years rolled on, and the face of Whitefish Falls began to change. By the 1990s, new families moved in, drawn by cheap land and mountain scenery. Retirees from out of state bought cabins. Young professionals from the cities arrived with no memory of what had happened on that October night. The town began to rebuild its social fabric, but something lingered beneath the surface. The silence was not gone. It had simply become part of the air. The newcomers learned quickly that there were names you did not mention, roads you drove past without asking about, and a memorial bench outside the high school that no one sat on. Through it all, Margaret Frazer never stopped walking. Locals would see her along the roads that wound near Miller's Creek, her scarf tied over her gray hair, her eyes scanning the trees as though expecting her daughter to emerge after decades of hiding. She spoke little, but her footsteps told the story of a mother who refused to let go. To some, she was a figure of pity. To others, she was a figure of strength. To everyone, she was a reminder of a past that Whitefish Falls wanted to forget by the time the 2000s and 2010s arrived. The case of the 3 missing teenagers had faded from the town's daily conversations. The courthouse basement files sat unopened, gathering mildew in the dark. New generations grew up knowing only whispers. Miller's Creek became a place people avoided at night without fully knowing why. The tragedy had been buried not only in the wilderness but in the collective memory of the community, yet silence does not erase truth. It only hides it, and sometimes what is buried waits patiently for the day it will be found again. The evidence room was silent except for the low hum of fluorescent lights. Detective Sarah Chen stood over a stainless steel table, staring at objects that had not seen daylight in 45 years. Each item had been removed from the rusted locker discovered deep in Glacier National Park and carefully resealed in plastic by forensics. Yet despite the sterile bags and the catalog tags, they carried the heavy presence of a story that refused to stay buried. She began with Bradley Morrison's wallet. The leather, once black, had faded into a dull brown. It was creased at the edges, softened by decades underground, but it still smelled faintly of earth and rust. Chen flipped it open and found the expected contents: his driver's license, a few wrinkled bills, a photograph of 3 smiling teenagers at a school dance. But behind the license, folded so tightly it had nearly disappeared into the seam, was something else. A scrap of paper. No larger than a matchbook. Using tweezers, Chen unfolded it. Faded blue ink revealed a phone number, and for chilling words: "If something happens to us, Dan." Her breath caught. A 17-year-old boy had tucked away a final message, one that suggested he knew danger was closing in. The phone number led to an old Missoula law firm that had shut its doors in 1983, its records lost when the senior partner died. The trail ended abruptly, leaving only a question. Who was Dan, and why had Bradley believed that contacting him might save them? Next, she examined Kevin Walsh's class ring. At first glance, it was ordinary. The gold gleamed under the lab lights, engraved with the year 1980 and Kevin's initials. To his friends, it had been a symbol of pride, a marker of the future he never reached. But under the microscope, Chen saw something hidden from every investigator before her. Fine scratches inside the band, so faint they blended with natural wear. They were numbers. A string of coordinates etched by hand. When mapped, they pointed to a remote section of the Bitterroot Mountains, miles from any trail or settlement. Kevin, meticulous and ambitious, had carried directions to a secret location on his finger, perhaps hoping someone would one day follow. Then came Jennifer Frazer's notebook. The Ziploc bag was fogged with age, but when Chen slipped on gloves and opened it, the pages whispered with a dry crackle. The handwriting was neat, careful, unmistakably Jennifer's. The first entries read like a diary turned watch. Black truck outside the school again Tuesday. Same man at the diner, no food ordered. Kevin says phone line sounds different, maybe someone listening. Each page built the picture of 3 teenagers under surveillance, noting movements in their quiet town with growing fear. The final pages shook Chen to her core. Jennifer had drawn a rough map of Whitefish Falls, the small town frozen in 1979. X marks dotted key places: the railroad depot, the lumber mill, several houses that had belonged to respected community members. Beneath the sketch, Jennifer's handwriting grew hurried, the letters slanting as though written in panic. They know. We know. Cannot trust anyone in town. Hiding evidence where someone will find it someday. Chen closed the notebook slowly, feeling the urgency that had driven Jennifer's hand all those years ago. These were not the scribbles of a teenager inventing drama. These were the desperate notes of a girl who understood that her life was in danger and who tried, in her last days, to leave behind a path for someone in the future. Forensics confirmed what Chen feared most. Soil samples from the locker showed traces of industrial preservatives, chemicals designed to protect metal against decades of decay. Radiocarbon dating of plant matter trapped inside proved that the locker had been buried in late 1979, within weeks of the disappearance. It was not planted later by some prank or misguided attempt at closure. The teenagers themselves had hidden these items. Bradley's hidden note pointed to a man named Dan and a law firm now lost to history. Kevin's ring carried coordinates leading into mountains no teenager could survive alone. Jennifer's notebook documented fear, surveillance, and betrayal within her own town. Together, they told a story more complex and more terrifying than any runaway theory had ever suggested. Detective Chen leaned against the table, her gloves resting on the cold steel. The case was no longer only about 3 missing teenagers. It was about a message they had buried for someone like her to find. They had uncovered something dangerous in their town, and they had known it would cost them everything. What waited at the coordinates hidden inside? Kevin's ring might be the final key to a truth that had been protected by silence for nearly half a century. The faint numbers scratched inside Kevin Walsh's class ring were entered into the mapping software, and the screen glowed with a red marker set deep within the Bitterroot Mountains. The location was remote, far from hiking trails or campsites, the kind of terrain that only seasoned loggers or surveyors would have ever reached. Detective Sarah Chen and her team packed gear for days of rough travel. When they arrived at the coordinates, the forest stood like a wall of silence, towering pines closing in around a clearing that had once held life. The clearing was scarred with the skeletons of a forgotten industry. Rusted machinery lay half-buried in moss. A cracked concrete foundation marked where a supervisor's cabin had stood. The smell of pine needles mixed with the faint tang of iron. It was the kind of place time had abandoned. But ground-penetrating radar told a different story. Beneath 3 feet of soil, an anomaly waited. The team dug carefully, each scrape of a spade revealing dark earth that had not been touched since the late 1970s. Soon, the metallic edge of a box broke the soil. It was an ammo box, wrapped in layers of thick plastic. When the final knot was cut, and the lid forced open, the past rose from the ground with the weight of revelation. Inside were papers still, dry and legible, preserved by desperate teenage hands. The documents told a story far larger than 3 missing lives. There were financial records showing cash payments, from lumber companies to officials who had signed permits that never existed. There were railroad manifests that documented trains carrying shipments that did not match their labels. Shipments that passed through Whitefish Falls under the cover of night. There were ledgers handwritten in the script of a depot supervisor, tallying money that flowed in from Canada and out toward buyers in distant cities. Piece by piece, the truth became clear. Whitefish Falls had not been only a quiet logging town. It had been the center of a smuggling operation, a transfer hub where stolen or illegal goods crossed borders and changed hands. The operation was not the work of outsiders. It was routed. In the town itself, the names on the records were men of influence. The bank president who processed the unexplained cash deposits, the railroad supervisor who falsified manifests, the lumber mill owner who provided cover with legitimate shipments. These were the very people who had once stood in church halls, wept at candlelight vigils, and searched the forests as volunteers. Detective Chen looked at the names, her stomach tightening. The teenagers had found this truth in 1979. They had gathered the evidence and hidden it in the woods, perhaps believing that one day someone would come looking, but the cost of their discovery had been their lives. If the town's most trusted leaders were willing to protect their secret smuggling empire at any cost, then the 3 friends had never stood a chance against them. And the question now was, whether someone still alive in Whitefish Falls would kill again to keep that secret buried forever. The names uncovered in the Bitterroot Mountains led Detective Sarah Chen to one man who was still alive. Robert Sullivan, the former railroad depot supervisor, now 84 years old, and living in a care facility outside Kalispell. He had suffered a stroke in 2019, his memory fragile, and his voice weak, but he had been there in 1979. He had signed the ledgers. He had handled the paperwork. If anyone still carried the truth, it was him. Chen sat at a small kitchen-style table in the facility, photographs of the recovered documents spread out in front of Sullivan. His daughter sat close by, worried and hesitant, warning that his memory often wandered. But when Sullivan's clouded eyes fell upon the ledgers, something sharpened in his gaze. His fingers, twisted with arthritis, reached for the papers as if they were both familiar and heavy with regret. His first words were a whisper. "I told those kids to let sleeping dogs lie." The room fell silent. His daughter looked up in shock, but Chen leaned forward, knowing the moment was fragile. With effort, Sullivan began to speak. In October of 1979, Bradley, Kevin, and Jennifer had come to him carrying pieces of the truth. They had discovered discrepancies in train shipments, strange payments, and late-night activity that did not belong in a small Montana town. Kevin had noticed the mismatched manifests during his summer job at the depot. Bradley had asked questions about shipping at the hardware store. Jennifer had connected family names through her research on local history. Piece by piece, they had assembled a picture of the smuggling ring, and they believed Robert Sullivan could help them expose it. But Sullivan had not been a man of courage. He admitted that he panicked. He was a small part of the scheme, a clerk, who looked the other way in exchange for steady pay. When the teenagers came to him, he did not protect them. He warned the men who ran the operation. Men who were pillars of Whitefish Falls. Men who had too much to lose if the truth ever reached the outside world. The meeting that followed was arranged under the guise of safety. The teenagers were told that if they came to the old logging camp, they would be paid for their silence and allowed to leave town unharmed. Sullivan's voice broke as he recalled. That night, he said he expected intimidation, perhaps threats, but not violence. What he witnessed instead haunted him for the rest of his life. The teenagers never left the clearing. They were silenced before sunrise, their evidence scattered into multiple hiding places, and their personal belongings carefully staged inside Jennifer's car at Miller's Creek to lead investigators away from the truth. Tears ran down his wrinkled face as he repeated the same words again and again. They were just kids. His confession, fragile yet undeniable, confirmed what had long been suspected. The disappearance of Bradley Morrison, Kevin Walsh, and Jennifer Frazer had not been an accident. It had been an execution carried out to protect a smuggling empire rooted in their own community. And now, Detective Chen knew the most haunting part of all. For decades, the killers had walked in the same parades, sat in the same church pews, and searched the same forests as the families they had destroyed. The only question left was how to break the truth to Margaret Frazer, who had carried the weight of hope for nearly half a century. Detective Sarah Chen drove through the winding roads of Whitefish Falls with the weight of decades pressing down on her shoulders. In her possession was the confession of Robert Sullivan, the documents unearthed from the Bitterroot Mountains, and the undeniable confirmation that the three teenagers had been murdered for uncovering corruption in their own town. Yet the hardest task still waited. She had to tell Margaret Frazer, the woman who had carried the pain of hope longer than anyone else. The Frazer home looked much the same as it had in 1979. The paint had faded, the shutters leaned, but the front porch light still glowed as if waiting for a daughter who never came home. Inside, the living room was frozen in time. Jennifer's photographs still lined the mantel. Her schoolbooks remained on a shelf, and upstairs, her bedroom had been left untouched for 45 years. Margaret, now 87, sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded in her lap. Her hair was silver, her body frail, but her eyes carried the same determination that had once led her through search parties and endless winters of waiting. Chen spoke gently, explaining each piece of evidence. The locker in the wilderness, the note hidden in Bradley's wallet, the coordinates inside Kevin's ring, the notebook filled with Jennifer's warnings, the documents buried in the mountains, the confession of Robert Sullivan. Every word landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling through decades of silence. Margaret listened without interruption, her gaze fixed on a family photograph showing Jennifer laughing at a school picnic only weeks before she vanished. When Chen finished, Margaret's voice was steady, though tears traced her cheeks. She said, Jennifer had always believed history was the key to preventing terrible things. She had seen her daughter's determination even as a teenager. She understood now that Jennifer had not been reckless. She had been brave. She had fought to expose corruption in a town built on silence, and it had cost her everything. Margaret said that her daughter's courage was not wasted, because the truth had finally found its way to light. 6 months later, Margaret Frazer passed away quietly in her sleep. Her funeral drew mourners from across the county, including those who had avoided her presence for decades. She was laid to rest beside a headstone that had carried her daughter's name since the early 80s, engraved with the word beloved daughter and left blank where the date of death had never been known. That space was finally closed, bringing the closure Margaret had waited nearly half a century to see. But while the Frazer family's vigil ended, the question that hung over Whitefish Falls was far from settled. What kind of justice could ever reach a conspiracy where most of the guilty were already buried in the ground? The confession of Robert Sullivan and the documents uncovered in the Bitterroot Mountains left no room for doubt. Federal investigators reopened the case, tracing old bank deposits, shipping records, and the ledgers that the teenagers had buried with such care. A few men were still alive to face justice: an aging bank officer, a former mill foreman, a retired railroad worker. They were arrested and questioned, their health failing and their memories clouded, but their names were enough to confirm what had long been hidden. Yet most of the original conspirators were already gone, carried to their graves. By time long before the truth emerged, for the families, the prosecutions felt less like punishment and more like the final footnote of a crime that could never truly be repaid. In March of 2025, the disappearance of Bradley Morrison, Kevin Walsh, and Jennifer Frazer was officially declared closed. It had taken 45 years, generations of silence, and the accidental discovery of a rusted locker in the wilderness to bring the truth to light. On paper, the case was solved. In the hearts of those who remembered, it was a wound that would never fully heal. Whitefish Falls became a place of reflection. Newcomers learned the story from old neighbors who finally dared to speak. The community understood that 3 young lives had been lost not to chance or accident, but to greed and corruption buried deep in their own foundations. The memorial bench outside the high school, once ignored, became a place where flowers appeared again. People sat in silence, not to forget, but to remember, yet the truth carried a darker weight. It showed how silence can rot a community from within, how fear can keep mouths closed for decades, how 3 teenagers with courage could shake the foundations of power, only to be silenced before they could speak. The past had remained hidden until time itself forced it to the surface, like a voice that refuses to stay buried. And so the story ends not with triumph, but with a haunting reminder. Some small towns bury their secrets so deeply that only time can unearth them. And when those secrets finally rise, they remind us that truth does not disappear. It only waits. If you found yourself questioning what other mysteries might be hidden in your own community's past, consider subscribing to Unscripted Tales. And if you are still here watching this story, it means this story deserves your like and subscribe. Please help me reach 5,000 likes on this story, because that is the target my mother set for you. It costs you nothing, but it means everything. Tell me from which city you are watching this story, because every city carries its own secrets, waiting for their turn to be told.